Okay, so what are we going to get today? So we're running some weekly sessions, going through specific areas, and our focus at this stage is on tier two and tier three personas. We're looking for feedback. Please, 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 can you give us feedback? As I say, let's use the Q&A and get that information available from you. We want to know everything, whether we're going in the right direction, the wrong direction, any questions you have, any enablement you need, things like that. And then after these sessions, we're going to share some surveys and ask you to give us more feedback, because really that's what we're looking for. The sort of things we're looking for is how can we help you adopt Service Operations Workspace, how we can make that fast, quick, efficient for you. What documentation do we need to provide you? Are we actually going about this in the wrong way or the right way? Are we thinking about your questions and addressing your business problems correctly? And what are we missing? What haven't we covered that you think would be really useful for you? And then what you're getting from this. So you're getting to engage with us as product managers and other key units within ServiceNow. You're getting us live and unadulterated and our attention, and also getting some good understandings of key aspects of the product. And you're going to get some walkthroughs and some demos as well. As I said, this is session number 5. We've only got one more session left in this series, which will be next week, covering admin personas. We've gone through an introduction. We've talked about major incident problem management, and this is the second of our sessions on change management. The standard safe harbor slide. We are now in a position where Xanadu has now become fully available for all of our customers this week, but we may well be talking about forward-looking items. Speaking with Daniel earlier this week, there are a lot of plans moving forward, and I'm sure he's going to be teasing and bringing those out for you and asking you for your feedback on those kind of things. So please bear this in mind. Please do not make any purchasing decisions or any implementation decisions on items that are not yet generally available within the application. Okay, and that is it for me. So I'm going to hand over to Daniel, who's going to take you through the session now.
Okay, what I'll probably do is just grab the screen share.
Okay.
So I can run through the slides myself then. The slides. You should be able to see my screen. Apologies, I have to run through some of the slides Jim's already shown us.
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay. With that. Okay, so just a quick kind of level set for change and where it sits in the organization, the wider IT organization. So we're seeing challenges for IT in general, and change is at the center of this transformation, technology transformation, digital transformation. Because what we need to do is we need to be able to make more changes faster, and we need to make them with better compliance and better stability. And that's because more in the business relies on IT. The business is more digital than ever. The organizations are more digital than ever. Spending more on tech, but it's more complex than ever. So they haven't necessarily seen the return on investment for tech that they've put in, or the return they wanted on the investment. And innovation has happened. You know, we have things like DevOps. We have product teams that are out in the business building their products and sometimes throwing them over the fence at IT. And that's created a really complex landscape. And quite often the IT processes that we have in place, like change management, don't facilitate these ways of working. So we need to think about how that works, and we need to allow a change process that's modern and federated, but still stays within the bounds of stability and compliance. And from a CISO point of view, you know, we're seeing more threats than ever. We're seeing more compliance than ever that we need to deal with. And dealing with that creates a headache, right? It creates a lot of work. We need to patch things really quickly, because vulnerabilities are not just more numerous, they're also more impactful. As we do more with IT, our vulnerabilities have more impact to the business. So all these things create a set of challenges around velocity, volume, stability, and governance. And really that's because teams are not talking to each other, because we don't have specific ways of working that meet the needs of those teams. And because we can't move fast enough to be in line with what the business need, with the demands the business need, the flexibility the business needs to make changes and to keep competitive, but also to keep on top of security threats, vulnerability threats, patching, and keep technology from being obsolete, and work at the pace that teams in working with methodologies like DevOps require. Okay. So that's a level set. I think at the moment I'm going to say come off mic and ask questions, and if it turns into chaos, then we'll have some kind of like chat or Q&A, and we'll promote the questions. But for the moment, if you feel like you have a question or a comment, then feel free to come off mic. Can people do that? Can people come off mute?
Yes.
They can. So you can come off mute. Right, okay. So what we have as a center of this, and this is what we're talking about with Service Operations Workspace, is a model-based approach to change. So we're not moving away from ITIL changes. We still have ITIL changes. We have models for ITIL changes, but we're talking about having additional models that allow the change team, the change process to work in a way that fits the needs of various teams working different ways around the business. And so what we see that is by simplifying the existing change process, by making it more purpose-driven, we can increase the velocity of change. We can make it easier to fill out the change form, for instance. We can use more templates. We can handle more volume, because if things are easier to do, we can do more volume. We can have less approvers on change. We can start breaking down changes more. So we don't have to have meetings with 20 or 40 or even 200 people in, I've seen it, where we have to approve a change because it's covering a whole load of CIs, because change is so difficult to raise that you only want to do it once, right? What we want to do is we want to create a situation where we can make lots of changes really quickly, but keep our stability and keep our governance in place. So why change models? So with ITIL, and we've covered this in the previous talk, we talked a little bit about this. We have launch and learn sessions that you can watch, and they'll be pointed towards them at the end of this presentation, which will show you how to access these presentations that go into these topics in more depth. What we're mainly focusing on today is some ideas around change models, and also how you can implement approval policies specific to those change models to make the approval process flow faster for change. Because ultimately, the time it takes to make a change can be very long. You can plan changes months in advance. There's nothing wrong with that. But the thing that holds back change, normally the biggest single factor holding back change, is how long it takes a change to get approved. And so while we're waiting for a change and it's in the new state, a lot of the time we don't really care. It's good for people to raise changes a long time in advance and sit on them, right? And then action the change later as it gets near the time they have more information. It's sometimes great to make a change and schedule it 3 months in advance if it's a big patching change or you've got a large program in place. There's nothing wrong with sitting on a change that's been scheduled and is approved and is in the forward schedule of change, and we're just waiting for the right time to implement it. What we do want to avoid is that change being held up in approval. And the amount of people who approve a change is kind of our proxy for how much effort a change takes, right? It will take a certain amount of effort to do things like add the right CIs to a change, to add the right justification, business justification, backout plans, all that kind of stuff for the change. That's pretty much an investment we make in keeping the change record up to date. What we don't want to happen is a load of approval effort to happen on a change, a load of meetings to happen with people who shouldn't be involved, or not invite the right people and maybe miss them. So we don't ask them whether they should be involved and we see impact later and they're not informed about it. What we want to make sure is we have the right people involved in the change and the change happens as quickly as possible during approval. And in order to do this, we have to think about our change models. So what we have at the moment with ITIL, normal, standard, emergency, again, covered in more detail in the earlier talks we've done. But standard change is changes which are low risk and repeatable. We don't have approval on them, right? So we're able to move them through really fast. And emergency changes are either changes that happened in the past or changes we need to move through, again, so quickly that we have a board that we call in and we make decisions in a kind of command and control way. We don't necessarily fill out all the details on the change at that time. Maybe we do it later. They're two special cases. Everything else is a normal change with ITIL. And that means all your changes, like your DevOps changes, all your infra changes, all your app changes, all those changes fit within your patching changes, fit within normal change. And the normal change process grows and becomes big and has to handle all these different types of logic and workflows and business rules and approvals. And so we end up overloading certain types of changes with approvals, or possibly even underloading some changes with approvals and understanding the risk around that change. So what we want to move to is a situation where we have the ability to have changes which are specific to particular parts of the business. Some examples are in here, like DevOps is a really good example. We have a load of data in our DevOps systems, and we have our DevOps velocity tool, our DevOps change tool, which allows us to pull in the information from these systems. If we leverage that information, change can sometimes happen really quickly. We know the test has passed. We know the pipeline has run properly. We know that stories are attached to our commits, that kind of stuff. So sometimes we can make changes really fast with DevOps if we have the right data. We can't do that for all changes, right? We don't want that to be part of our normal change process. We want it to be a specific process that relies on that data. Things like infra changes. Infra do changes differently from how apps are changed. So we may need to have different data points. We may need to have a slightly different process. For our infra changes, we may want to capture different information. And things like low risk change, so changes that sit between normal and standard change, changes that maybe don't need an approval if they're in a maintenance window, or don't need an approval if they're not on a production system, but do need an approval if they're during a production system, or do need an approval if they're in a blackout window or not during a maintenance window. So the idea is that we're creating different processes around change. We're creating different ways of doing change, and the model captures the process we're using mainly. The models are about process, and they're about the data that you get on the change that enables that process. So you can see in here, we've got things like states. Not all changes follow the same state model. In ITIL, standard change doesn't have all the same states that normal change has in. That's the benefit of using standard change. We don't assess or approve that change, but we still schedule it. We still implement it. For unauthorized changes, right? We've already done the change, so implementation happens before the authorization of the change. So we're doing the states in a slightly different order. So different changes have different states, and allowing us to be flexible with the state model is the first thing that we do with change models, is understanding the state model for that particular use case and using those states. And then the flows that we use for the change are slightly different too. And for change models, we break down our flows into state-based flows. So we have a flow for each one of the states. That flow only exists when the change is in that state. That means we can get rid of the big monolithic flow that went end-to-end for normal change and had lots of variations and lots of rollbacks and lots of complexity. You know, I've seen them. And we can have flows for each state. And that means when we have a model that uses a particular state, we can use the flow for that state. And it doesn't matter if it's an unauthorized change that's doing authorized after you've implemented it. We don't have to handle the different conditions where state flows from one thing to another. We have a flow for that state. When the change enters that state, the flow fires, it does what it needs to do. When the change is now it goes to another state, a different flow may fire. So flows work differently too. Again, in more detail, covered in other calls that we've had. There's lots of information out there. What we're talking about today is mainly approval policies, because approval policies allow you to make the approval more streamlined. So again, the number of people involved in approval, the amount of time that approval takes is a major factor in how efficient and effective our change process is. If we don't involve enough people, changes happen, bad things happen. If the change goes wrong and the right people weren't called, that's bad. Also, if we ask everyone to every change, we end up slowing down the change process to the point where we're not competitive anymore. So we need to make sure that we have the right approvals in place. Okay. Moving forward. So in here, just looking again at the change models, just to look through at the states that we have. So we're using for our change models, we're using a set of states. These states are reusable items that we use for each one of our change models. Each change model is effectively a set of states. That's all it is. And there's a set of people who can use that set of states. So each change model has a specific purpose, and you have particular people who can use that change. I'll show a bit more about that when we do a demo. But the idea is that you curate these set of states and you reuse them in your change models. So the authorized state for normal change is the same authorized state as it is for unauthorized change. Right? You're still seeking approval during that state. The purpose of unauthorized is still the same. The purpose of assess is still the same. When you hit implement, you're still implementing, right? You still set the start date, the actual start date of the change, and when implement ends, you still set the actual end date of the change. So what this is about having states which are strung together into models, which are driven to make a specific purpose happen more efficiently and more effectively. Just an example in here, we had normal and standard change. I've talked about this before. So normal change is just everything that isn't a standard change or an emergency change. And the standard changes are pre-approved, pre-authorized changes that we know are low risk. But in the middle of that, there's a lot of changes. We have low risk changes. And what we can do is we can, for instance, stand up a new model for low risk changes. And the reason we can do this is that we have approval policies, which we'll talk about in this call. So by having approval policies, we can inspect data on that change, and we can allow that change to move through like a standard change if the right conditions are hit. And we can put approvals on that change if they aren't hit. So we talked before about if the change is during a maintenance window, it's not a standard change anymore. You have a server reboot. Maybe you're allowed to do the server reboot to a sub-prod system, but if the system is a prod system, it doesn't let you. So it's actually more, it drives more compliance than standard change. It drives better velocity like standard change does, but it also allows us to stay within the bounds of our control process. So we're not pushing changes into the normal change process that will hit things like cab and maybe take ages to complete, just to do a server reboot and prod. What we're doing is we'll have a fit for purpose change, which handles our low risk changes. And these changes we'd expect to be templated as well. So we want to be able to extend templates to allow our low risk changes to be fully templated and follow a specific model that allows them to move through very quickly if they can and have a sufficient approval if they don't, and to be marked as a low risk change. So we know what changes are following that path. Okay, so I'm going to hopefully be able to do a demo now. There's always a sense of hopefully around demos. I'm just going to share my demo instance.
While you're getting that demo instance up, Daniel, everybody, if we could just remember to use the Q&A rather than the chat for any questions you've got, it just means that we can collate it better for sharing at a later date with everybody. So if you could use Q&A rather than chat, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay, are there any questions right now that I need to answer?
None outstanding from chat or anything at the moment, unless anybody wants to come off mute.
Any of you want to come off mute while I find my find the right screen to share?
I just had a quick question on low risk changes.
Hey, Aaron.
And maybe this is identified in another a little later in the presentation, but the how do you know if it's a low risk change when they're creating the record in order to create it as that model, or are you assuming that they understand their change to be low risk when they start building their change?
Okay, it's a really good question, a good place to go in the demo. So first of all, we are building functionality to allow templates to be used for all models in the way that standard change templates are used. So right now you can use templates for any change, right? Template exists as something that is available in the task table, so you can use it for anything. But what we don't get with that template, and what we do get for standard change, is first of all, the ability to surface that template in here, which is the catalog. And the second thing we don't get is we don't get process around the life cycle of that template. And there are some other things around the specifics of the template as well. Like, standard change gives the ability to set a set of tasks to get fired at different stages. There are some specific things with standard change that you probably all know, love, and use, or you should be. They've been around for years. For low risk change, because it's not a standard change, at the moment, you're blocked from using that standard change template functionality. So I would see, and what we're building is the ability to use templates for all models. So you attach a template to a model. If you have a low risk model, that's telling you that the process I'm going to be using is a low risk model, a low risk process. First thing is you would access it through a template. So in here, we have our templates that pre-fill in some changes for us, right? If you pick a template, reboot Windows Server, at the moment, that will only follow standard change. It will not seek approval. It may be that this particular type of reboot Windows Server, it may be that you say, well, hold on a second, right? I don't want to make a Windows Server reboot in a prod system when there's a P1. Okay, so you can't do that with standard change at the moment without creating approvals in standard change, which is not considered good practice. So what would happen is when you pick this template, instead of following the standard change model, it would follow the low risk model. And when I say it's low risk, it doesn't mean that we treat all the changes like low risk. We'll cover this in approval policies. What it means is that a set of approval policies will fire to make sure that change is low risk, to make sure the attributes that we specify as a change team mark that change as low risk. We will look at things like those examples. You can look at things like whether it's in a production system, whether it impacts a critical system, whether the system that's affected, the system you're changing, is critical. You can look to see whether it's in a maintenance window or whether it's in a blackout window. You can look at the success score of the team to make sure that they frequently make good changes or possibly don't, right? So what we can do is we can say that actually, if this change has certain features, certain attributes, it can go through without approval or with minimal approval. But we can also say, if there's some circumstances that mean you're trying to do something which you consider low risk, but there are some circumstances which are operational, which you may not have visibility of, or just the nature of the change you're doing doesn't meet the criteria you kind of assume do, then we will route this change for more approval, right? We can still send it to cab if we want. But the idea of doing that, instead of doing it in normal change, you can put these changes together and say, this is what the organization considers low risk change. These are the templates that are able to use that model. There are some checks and balances in our approval policies for that model to make sure that they are following the right path. But if they're not following that path, we route them towards what looks more like a normal change. So you're creating a grouping and you're creating a concept around normal change, which is the model and the states it follows. And you've got some templates which enable that change to be highly templated, so it's repeatable. But you do sometimes route it for approval. So we're not upsetting any people who, you know, who follow ITIL and like standard change to have no approvals, which they should. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. So just to be completely clear, having templates like standard change for all models is something we're doing in the future. We're hoping to target it for our Zurich release. Okay, but that's a safe harbor and everything. Okay. So I'm in Service Operations Workspace now. And what I was going to show you is change models. So in here we have a set of templates for our pre-approved changes, our standard changes, and we also have a set of other templates which are actually models. There's a mix of models and templates in here. And I'm just going to give you a sneak preview, though it's quite hard to navigate on my screen at the moment because the title bar is interfering with what I can see. So just let me move a couple of things. If I pop across over to this one, go to Service Ops Workspace, you can see that what we're actually doing is, and this will be coming with our November release of Service Operations Workspace. We can see if I go in here to raise a change, we're putting in the plumbing to allow this set of templates. You can see now on the left-hand side, I've got the ability to start filtering. Okay, so I can look through a large set of templates and filter down to make sure that I have the right category. So you can see as we move to having more templates with different models, we can start looking at categories of changes and we can start picking out a change and select the right template really easily. And you can see in here as well, at the moment, we've only got the templated changes. If I remove these filters, you can see we have in there our emergency normal change. If I pin that and have normal change in, I see only pins changes. I can see normal change in there. So we're making it easier for users to navigate the correct change. The other thing is with change models, and I'll show you where this is in a second. We can, get rid of that one. Okay. We can make it so that only certain people can see a model and use it. So you can only use an infra change model if you're part of one of the infra groups. So again, we're tailoring this catalog and what they can see to the right audiences. Okay. So when I go in and raise one of these changes in Service Ops Workspace, I can see in here that I'm presented with a state model view to start off with. So the overview page here has a set of states, and that's really clear to see. So as changes follow different models of the normal change, standard change, and emergency changes, they have different states. We will see the states up here for that particular change model. You only get this in Service Operations Workspace. It's not something that's implemented in UI 16. The other thing is, as we fill in this change details, this is a pretty common set of values to fill in the change site here. So I'm going to just save this change, low quality change. And you can see that what I get is a set of, when it loads, I get a set of containers which contain things like the ability to add scope and impact. So I can go in here and I can add scope. I'm being prompted to do the things that I need to do in that state of the change. Again, this is specific to Service Operations Workspace. This is your overview container. We covered that in the last call. The model that we're looking at should define what I need to fill in at that stage in the change. So it tells us what sections I will have on this form at this time that I'm being prompted to fill in, making it easier to fill out the change. Okay. Any questions so far? Good. If I look at my change models, going across to UI 16, you can see in here, we give you some out of the box. Again, for Yokohama release, right at the end of the sprints we're doing right now, we're looking to provide some content for you for change models, approval policies, risk conditions. Don't worry if you don't know what these things are. Watch the videos at the end of the slide presentation. We've got to click on the link and watch the videos. Risk conditions and state models, state transitions, all these things, we're looking to provide some more examples for you. Some examples of the things we provided here, we're looking to extend this. So you have more to base your decisions on, more to learn from, more to reuse if you want, or more to extend if you want. So some example models, we go into normal. And you can see in here we have our model states. So these are the states we saw in Service Ops Workspace just now. And you can see in here we've defined how the change moves from state to state. So it can move from new to assess, or it can move from new to cancelled. We can define when it moves from new to assess. If I go from schedule to implement, let me see, I think this is one that I can show. You can see we've got some transition conditions. We can't move to implement if the change is on hold, right? If it's put on hold during scheduled, it will not let you move to implement. So what we're doing is we're controlling how the change moves from state to state. This takes clutter out of the change flow, right? So this is a thing telling you for this model and this state, I can move from here to here if these conditions are here, or maybe I'll automatically move from here to here, like all the approvals have been generated, I can move out of authorized. Or I can't move from here to here unless this thing is filled in or these conditions are met, like changes on hold. So again, it's just a really easy visual way of representing how a change moves from state to state, when it can move from state to state. You no longer need to put that in your flow because you can put it in state conditions. So what we're doing with change models is we're having a change model, which is a set of states, and those states have state transitions. The state transitions control the flow. In here, we've also got things like record presets. I'll come to that in a minute. You can see we're setting the type to normal. This is because we're not using the type field anymore, but you may have some logic that still references the type field. We don't want to break things for you. So in this record preset, we set the type to normal because it's a normal change model, right? So we're keeping the type and model of the change in sync, just in case you have some legacy logic. We're also controlling who can access the change. In here, we've got read roles and write roles. So I did this record click here. And we can say who can look at the change in the catalog, who can use that change, and also who can edit the templates for it, who can edit the model for this particular change. You may want to federate it out, and you may want to let teams control their own models. Maybe you don't. I don't know. So then we go to advanced security, and in here we do the same thing, but we do it using things called user criteria, which are a lot more flexible. Again, your ServiceNow admins, devs, and maybe you will understand how this works, but it gives you a really flexible system where you can code in and pull from other systems and do whatever you want. It's an extensible model around who can use that change. So this defines who can use the change and who can edit this change model. Okay. One of the things we're doing, which is interesting, and it's probably in this instance, we've added a non field for new customers to the change types. Okay, this is quite important. It's kind of breaking news as well, I suppose. It's the first time I've covered this on a call. We would recommend that with sufficient testing and with the right kind of implementation sequence, you also, when you're adopting change models, you also add the type choice non to your changes. This is because if you have a model that's something like infrastructure or a model like patching or low risk change, you don't want to also set the type to normal or the type to emergency, right? It doesn't make sense. We want to be able to say, for a normal model, we have the normal type. For the standard model, we have the standard type. For the emergency model, we have the emergency type, right? As per ITIL. But if we're stepping outside of that box and we have an infra change, a patching change, or a low risk change, we want to set that to none. So first thing is we'd recommend that you create that choice type none and add it. We couldn't add it automatically for you because it would break things. Okay. Let me go back to our listing here. Okay. So we've covered change models. We've covered the flow between models. We've covered the catalog. Now I'm going to move back to our slide deck. Okay. Any questions so far?
There's nothing in the chat at the moment.
So we're moving through these slides a little more quickly because we're short on time. We've got an hour rather than an hour and a half. Okay. So we talked about change models. You talked about the low risk change model, and we talked about the things you look at in that model to make it specific, to make it purpose driven, like the states you use, like the state-based flows, like the approval policies, like the templates, and the tasks that get generated, again, forward-looking functionality, and where it fits in the catalog. So we have low risk change as an example of model. We also have DevOps change. We provide this out of the box if you turn on the plugin for DevOps. So that allows us to step through the model states and to collect data from our DevOps tools and have the approval policies which look at that data from DevOps. So we have a purpose-driven change using the right approval policy, using the right state flow for DevOps. Change registration, right? We're receiving changes from our suppliers, or there's bits of the business that aren't following the change process for whatever reason. That can be valid. We want to have their changes in the forward schedule of change. So we just register the changes, right? Our states are just basically, here's a change in schedule, goes into implementation, review, close. We don't authorize it. Okay, so it might be that ServiceNow are telling you they're going to, I don't know, patch your instance on a certain date. You don't get a choice in whether that change happens. You kind of do, but supplier-based change. So for change registration, we have again a model for that change. Okay, so we've talked about change models, and we've already demoed them in Service Operations Workspace. We're going to talk about approval policies. Any questions on change models? Come off mute. Anyone doing it? Identify any models they like? You want to share? No, it's cool. So approval policies are really important to change management. Approval policies allow you to make the right approvals at the right time. They allow your changes to flow through faster, potentially, and the changes to be safer. And they allow you to measure why an approval was taken or why an approval decision wasn't taken, what data was present in the change at the time, record it so it's more compliance. So you get volume, velocity, stability, and compliance. What we see as the adoption route for approval policies is this. So first of all, adopt models, right? So even if it's just models for normal standard emergency change, switch your logic over to use the model field, because that's where we're going with change, right? That's the path the industry is taking as well. It's not just us talking about change models. It's a lot of different people. It's not my idea, and it wasn't my predecessor's Greg's idea. It's something that's been present in the industry for a while. If you have the change models, that gives you the opportunity to tailor your approval for that model, to look at the data that's in a DevOps change, to look at the data that's in a patching change. The data for a patching change may be more contained within other artifacts you've got in planning tools. You know, you generally with patching, what you do is you do a lot of work up front to make sure the patch is secure and does what it's meant to do. And then you patch a whole load of stuff over a whole number of weeks. So those changes are more about scheduling than they are about approval of the change. The approval is elsewhere. You want to be able to reference that. DevOps changes, we have our DevOps tools, which are things like planning tools, security tools, and testing tools. We can do the change faster, not because we're not doing stuff, because it's done elsewhere. It's done to the left of the process. So by adopting change models, you get a place, you can tailor your approval policies. Then we build in our change approval policies. So this is a move from having a workflow with approval actions in it, lots of approval actions, which are all over the place and difficult to see. And if you want to change one of them, you're changing the entire workflow effectively. Even if you only change a workflow at one point, you're effectively editing that workflow and needs a lot of testing. What we do is we take that out of the workflow. And at that point, we have a flow that just says, get some approval and use this method. That's your change approval policy. I'll show you it in a minute. So what we do there is we rebuild, or we use as ServiceNow starting point, the approval policies to do what we do now. Look, high, medium, low risk of change. Route it to CAB if it's a high risk change. Route it for very little approval if it's a low risk change. We do the same thing we do now, but we use approval policies for it. And then we can build from there. And we can start looking at data around the change for our approval policies. We can start looking at whether there's any P1 instance open right now. We can start doing things like looking at whether the change has been done to a critical system. So we can look at the risk of the change and specific attributes from within the approval policy. I'll show you an example. And then we can move forward and start looking at dynamic risk. So we can start looking at things like how good that team are at making change. What's the success and failure like of that change historically? So we're looking at across change to make decisions in the overall risk of the change. Again, we covered this in our risk management talk, which is part of the launch and learn, which will be linked to later in the video. But the idea is we're consuming that specific risk data, looking across all the change to make decisions on the change. So we have high, medium, low risk and route the change appropriately. We have look at specific data on the change, like whether it's affecting a critical service. And then we have things like, what does the overall change process look like for this type of change, this group making the change, etc. What we're doing looking in the future is building better ways of collecting that data around the entire change process. So looking at how good we are at finding out whether changes failed. When we know how good we are at finding out whether changes failed, looking at how good we are at knowing what the impact of those failed changes are. Because it's only really when we understand how good we are at knowing whether changes failed and getting better at it, and attaching the right incidents to change so we know the full impact, that we can really start looking at risk as a fully mature process within change. So we want to be able to provide help with that. And also, coming in November release, we've got the start of this, Gen AI insights for risk. So being able to have insight into why the risk was generated for the change, so that people at the time of approval, when the approval policy fires and you get asked for an approval, they will be told aspects of the change that arrived at this point for risk management. Again, that's for our Pro Plus customers, so our customers that bought licenses to use Gen AI. Right. Okay, so we've seen this before in a different guise. This is around the different things we have around the change. We're going to talk about the approvals for that change and how they file within the work. Okay. So we talked about this a little before. So at the moment, approvals are hidden in the workflow. The logic is in the workflow, it's embedded. The workflow is end to end. So when we have a normal change, it goes right from the start, changing new, right through to when the change closes. We want to break that down by having state-based flows. And we have a state model that's fairly inflexible at the moment. Moving to models, we have approval policy, which decouples them from the flow so that we can tweak those approval policies accordingly and not impact the flow. We have an audit trail for approval policies. It tells us, and I'll show you, it tells us why the approval was made, why that particular decision was made around the change, to route it for approval or not route it for approval. So we can link through to compliance and audit. And by having state-based flows, we can attach approval policies to that particular state, that particular action in the state flow, and we can reuse that state for different models of change, different purposes of change. Okay. So what we do is we use the thing like our dynamic approval engine. This is based on decision tables within ServiceNow. So what we're doing, you can see examples here. It's quite small, but you can see them. We're looking at aspects of the change other than the change risk to make the approval decision. So we're looking at a set of decisions which should be in line with our change policy, saying things like, if it's on a critical system, route it this way. If it's not on a critical system, route it that way. If there's currently a clash, if there's a conflict for the change, route it this way. If there's no conflict, route it that way. If it's during a maintenance window, route it this way. If it's not during a maintenance window, route it this way. So we're creating a set of things that will meet our policy, because those kind of statements I just made are actually what's contained a lot of times within the policy documents for change. They will say things like, if a change is made to critical service, then appropriate people need to authorize the change, right? So what we're doing is we're actively and in a traceable way showing how that policy is met, rather than doing it in a kind of indirect way of saying, well, if it's a critical service, the risk of the change is high, therefore we'll route it to CAB, right? That does satisfy compliance, but it satisfies it in a much more indirect way than having a rule that fires saying, no, every time this is to a critical service, we will route it to a CAB. Okay, and we get decisions out of these things. So approve, reject. So automatically approve the change, automatically reject the change, tell them to go back to start and rework the change, or manually approve the change with a set of people, maybe at a CAB, maybe through using approval in ServiceNow. Good, okay. And using the dynamic data, I touched on this before. So this is the example of our success scores for change. So what this is doing is looking at the team that are making the change, the assignment group, and saying, have they had any P1 incidents in the last few weeks or last few days, last 30 days? What was their success rate like of change? And we apply a multiplier. This is configurable by you to give them an overall score for the success, the likelihood of this change being successful. So what we've got is, we've got the probability of success, which is generated here. And we've got the impact of success of the change, which is generated by things like, is it being done to a critical service? And we can look at this calculated risk score, and we can route the change according to that risk score. Or we can look directly at the success score for the team and route the change accordingly as well. The choice is up to you. And as I said, in Yokohama, we're providing some examples, we hope, of how that works. Okay, demo time. Any questions coming up to demo?
So we have one question in Q&A, Daniel. When is dynamic approval engine available?
Now.
Yep.
I'll show you.
So as you say, the examples are going to come in the Yokohama timeframe, hopefully, but those policies are available already for you to set up.
Okay, I'm going to go to a different instance, actually. So normal change policy in here, we have an example, and this is basically what a lot of people have been doing with change for a long time, right? We're looking at the change and we're making decisions based on it. So if I go into one of these, requires CAB approval. We can set a set of conditions for when it requires CAB approval, which is when there's no assignment group. So someone's trying to do a change without an assignment group, or this is probably more relevant to people, it's a high or moderate risk change. It will route the change to CAB approval, right? It's what we've done for years. It's just being done in a nice, neat way using decision tables. It's no longer in the flow or workflow logic. It's sat here and you can reuse it. I'm going to go to a more complex example, which is in a different instance. So in here, I'm going to go to a DevOps change, which is looking at far more data. Let me see here. So you can see we're looking at much more data as the input here. We've got things like code coverage. We've got things like whether the load test failed, regression test failed, number of outages in the last 7 days. All these things have been pulled back from either ServiceNow, the operational system, or other systems. And previously with DevOps, the DevOps team may have things in their pipeline that don't allow the pipeline to continue if, for instance, there's no stories attached to their commits. What we're doing here is we're checking it. We're double checking it using the change system. So we know at the point of change that that DevOps policy is compliant. Right? They've done what they said they were going to do. Their pipeline is run. They're trying to deploy code automatically into prod. We know that they have got stories attached to their commits. But the DevOps systems don't have access to the operational platform, which is ServiceNow. They don't know how many outages there were in the last 7 days. They don't know whether there's currently an outage. So DevOps tend to have the pipeline. They fire the pipeline, they raise a change, they want to change right now. Is there currently an outage in the production system linked to it at the moment? So we have policy inputs. And a lot of these are generated, a lot of these are pulled through API calls to other systems. We provide a lot of these APIs and the calls out of the box for you with our DevOps tool. So we can actually gather this data fairly easily from within the flow, using out of the box API calls, which are wrapped for you, and you can just pull them in. And then you can have that data in the change, and you can see that data in the change, and you can see when a decision is made, like here. So we've got DevOps change will be rejected if certain things happen. It will auto approve. I'll go into this one. It will auto approve if these conditions are met. So the pipeline will just run, no approval needed, right? Nice fast DevOps change, but we've proven that they've adhered to the guidelines. If I go into a change, so it's operations workspace, give me a second, that change is loaded. You can see it within the change in the related records. In here, okay, we don't have them for this one. I'm going to find one, but we can see the applied change policy. We can see what policies were applied to the change and what the results of that change. So in here, we haven't got one. I'll see if I can find one. But the change policy that was applied, so that might be the normal change approval policy was fired, the action taken, and the decision made in the change. So we can look at the data for that approval policy and see why a decision was taken to auto approve a DevOps change, that the data was there, or we can see that the decision was taken to reject a change, or we can see the decision was taken to route it to cab because of these reasons. So it's auditable. So again, we're proving compliance whilst allowing the change process to flow really fast.
I just confirm that's the dependencies on DCV for what you've just demoed. Is that right?
Some of it. So the specific implementation around pulling stuff from the developer tools, then yes, you're right, there is. That's available to all our pro customers. But the approval policies themselves are part of the core platform. Every customer gets them. The ability to audit the change in this way, if an approval policy fires, all our customers get that as well. The ability to have an approval policy which works on success scores. Success scores are part of our pro package. So you have to be a pro customer or have a license beyond pro, like Pro Plus or Enterprise. So there are features that support approval policy, which like DevOps, like ITSM Pro, but the actual approval policy I've talked about and everything within it is contained within our standard license.
Thanks. Yeah.
No problem. Okay. Any more questions? Okay. Go back to the slide there. So approval policies are reusable. We can use them for different models of change in different states. The other thing that I would suggest is approval policies can be used beyond the actual authorization of the change. So the first level of doing that, the kind of first level of maturity, is using approval policies to do things like seek peer assessment for a change. So if you have if your policy says for a normal change or for an infra change, the engineer making the change has to raise the change, and then someone else in their team has to look at the change beforehand. Previously in ServiceNow, we did that. The implementation around that would be that it would be assigned to them, and they would move it to the next stage, showing they checked it. We recommend that you move to having an approval policy that actually records that they've done it. So during the assess state, you have an approval policy that says, If the change is a normal change and Jim raises it, then I don't know, maybe Janet, someone on their team, has to do an approval before it can move to authorize. The other thing that we've seen customers doing or wanting to do as well is things like pre-flight checks. So where you have a particularly critical system that's being changed, you may well, before the change moves to implement, just want to double check that some of the stuff you thought of or checked at the time the change was authorized is still the case, right? So that won't be attributes of the change necessarily, although you could check that. That's things like, just before I move to implement, is there a P1 right now? Or do I need to just get some additional approval? Because although we authorized the change 3 weeks ago, it's good to go, we've got a window, there were no conflicts, everything was good. Actually, right now, we've got a P1 in production, and we need a senior person to authorize that change to go ahead, because we don't want to confuse things when there's a P1 on a critical system. So we just want to maybe hold that change from going ahead. So you can do things like pre-flight checks. That's something that some customers have in their change policy and they're doing manually right now. So change approval policies can be used for more than just authorize. I would suggest for the start, get your head around using it for authorizing the change, but there are opportunities to extend beyond that and start using it or putting the brakes on the change process or allowing it to flow at different stages of the change. And ultimately, approval policies simplify the flow because you're taking them out of the workflow and putting them in their own object that can be reused. The flow itself just calls an approval policy. So the flow becomes simpler, and the logic is contained within an approval policy, which then can be reused in many different flows. Okay. I think that's where we wanted to get to for the first section. I think we should open Q&A.
Yep, so there's nothing more in the Q&A. So if anybody's got any questions that they want to go, we've got just under 10 minutes left. So are there any questions from the panel here, or for the panel? Very quiet this afternoon.
I could say that you mentioned change success score. We are looking to implement that, but as part of the risk calculation. So it was interesting to hear what you said about potentially using it as part of the approval policy. So that was interesting.
I think it can be used both ways even within a single organization. I think that success scores are definitely part of risk, right? They're part of our 4 kind of pillars of risk that you look at. So we look at risk assessments, we look at risk conditions, we look at the derived score, which is the thing I talked about, impact and probability, which takes success scores into account, and we look at machine learning for risk. That gives us a risk score, right? And looking at those 4 aspects gives us a really comprehensive risk score for the change. High, medium, low. Nice and simple. People understand it. You're going to see in our November release, again, Safe Harbor side, that we start to have Gen AI to explain how those risk scores were arrived at. So we can tell a person at the point of approval, this change is high risk because these conditions were hit, right? The team are not particularly successful at making change, or they are particularly successful at making change, or there's a P1 system, there's a critical one system that's being impacted by the change. So I start having an explanation of where that high, medium, low is broken down to. What we see as interesting is that not all changes want to look at it just like that, right? They don't want a derived thing, high, medium, or low. I think that's the point you were making, is that actually we may want to just check it as well. We may want to just check the success score for a standard change and say, you know what, this standard change, if this team are breaking things with change right now, they're not allowed to use standard change. They need an approval. We have customers who have taken this all the way forward, right? They're looking at systems where things happen, like they have blackout windows where only certain changes, only teams with a success score over a certain level can make change, because they want to make sure during this window it's not a complete blackout, but it's where only really successful teams can make changes and other teams just have to do them at other times. And they're finding that as an effective way of keeping change kind of flowing during times when there's moderate level of business criticality going on. It's not a complete blackout. It's not when the Christmas sales are on for a retail customer, or when the tax returns are due for a financial customer, or when the financial results are being made available for a bank. It's one of the kind of areas which is kind of grey between a blackout and a maintenance. We just want to make sure people who are particularly successful at change and making changes during that period, so have an approval policy for it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Any other questions?
If there aren't any questions, you're able to show the AI you mentioned then about with the risk explanation.
No, but we
Okay.
can have other things. We can find out. We can do some beavering in the background to make sure that you can see that. I imagine that will be heavily trailed into the November release. We're building it at the moment. I don't have an instance. I wasn't expecting to. I wish I could. It's nice.
Okay.
But yeah, we're looking at providing a risk summary for change. Done a lot of work on it.
Cool.
Coming
we've
soon.
got another question in the Q&A, Daniel. The templates for future release that you're talking about for Zurich, will that be able to autofill related change tasks as well? Because standard or as the standard change templates can be set up today, so that can be a change and related tasks.
That's the plan. That's what I'd like to happen. I see no reason why you wouldn't. It's a great bit of functionality, right? You know, that's always been something when I did implementations for the last 10 years that people really wanted within change, and not having the complexity of having that in the workflow and having to have code that adds tasks, and you know, it's just a pain. So I'd really like to get that in, and I can see it, and a lot of customers ask for that. So yes, pretty high on the priority list.
Brilliant.
We just have to work out the technical stuff.
Yeah. Okay, that's it for Q&A, I think.
I think it's worth pointing out. So at the moment, what we're doing is we're working on the final work for SOW and the November release, and we're working on Yokohama release stuff right now. So that's why I can't give you certainty on what's in Zurich. It's certainly planned for Zurich, but we start that work pretty soon.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, thank you, Daniel. Thanks once
Do you want
again.
to just bring up the slide, Jim, with the where to get more information?
Yeah, go on then. Go do that. Shall I do it, or do you want to do it?
I can do it. I can do it.
Good stuff. And we'll share this out with everybody as well.
Yeah. Okay, so more information. There you go. So community content, we're putting out community content. We have people like Jim and Janet and Kaylin and people like that putting out community content for us. We're looking at more and more stuff that you can just watch offline. So when we have these sessions, we record them. When we hear what people need to see, we do sessions, we record them. We have a lot of content out there. So we would recommend going to the community site. We can send a link to that particular change one, but I think you can go to it from here. Jim's summarized that. And also in docs, we're working really hard. We're working really hard on our doc site to make it more and more around adoption as well as the technical features of change. So look out for changes to the doc site coming soon.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much.
You can change models. It's the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the present for some of us, right? But it's definitely the future as well.
Definitely. Okay. I think we're at the hour now, so thanks everybody for their time again.
Thank you, everyone who turns up.
Next week.
Appreciate you being on the calls.
Yeah, see you all again next week. Thank you.
Later.
Bye.
Thank you.